This is the first video where we're going to talk a little bit about how we can go about designing samples so that we can collect data which we can then analyze and examine statistically. But before we do that, we need to define some terms. Two terms that we're going to see quite a bit in this chapter are observational study and experiment. We're going to focus on observational studies in this first section of the chapter, and then we'll look more at experiments in the second section of the chapter. And of course, the question is, what's the difference between the two? An observational study is exactly what the words imply. You take a look at individuals in your study, and you measure some variable that you're interested in about these individuals, but you're just observing them. You're not attempting to influence the responses of those individuals in any way. So there's no influence in an observational study. Experiments are a little bit different. You still have the individuals in your study, and you're still going to be measuring some sort of variable. However, you are imposing what we call a treatment on each individual in your study, so you are influencing them in some way. We'll talk a little bit about what treatments are and all that, but you can think of a basic study, or a basic experiment as being maybe the manufacturers of a certain drug are interested in seeing whether their drug is actually effective at taking care of some sort of illness. So maybe the influence would be that they administer their drug to some people that are taking part in the experiment, and other people in the experiment don't get the drug, and they might measure the outcome. So again, the difference between an observational study and an experiment is just whether or not you are influencing the individuals that you're examining. The next couple of terms that we need to be familiar with is that of population and sample. These are two terms that's going to be very important to be able to differentiate between. So the population is just the entire group that you're looking at, or you're taking information about. So we talked a little bit about today in class about wanting to calculate the average height of all St. Francis students. So the population in that case would, of course, be all St. Francis students. But then we mentioned that maybe that wouldn't be particularly convenient to try to measure the heights of all 150 students here. So instead of trying to measure everybody in the population, we would just take a sample and we would use that sample data to estimate the average height for the entire population. So a sample, again, is just part of the group, whereas the population represents the entire group. Again, it's going to be important to be able to distinguish between those two terms. You're going to see them show up a lot in subsequent chapters in this class. Even more terms to talk about. So sort of related to the idea of a population and a sample is the idea of sampling versus conducting a census. If we are sampling a population, of course that would mean we are taking a sample from the population. So that means we're just studying a part of the population in order to gain information about the entire population. So again, this is just, we're looking at a sample. Ooh, that didn't work out well. And this is quite different from a census, and this is the same type of census that you hear that the government conducts, every 10 years. We're using the word in the same way. That means we were looking at the entire population. Of course, when the government conducts it, that means that they are trying to take into account every single person who lives in the country, and they're trying to record some information about them. If we are taking a census, that means that we are attempting to measure the variable that we're interested in for every single person or individual in our population. So a census will look at the population then. So of course this means that you need to think about I guess the, excuse me. Sorry about that. So anyway, when we're talking about a census, we want to talk about, or we want to think about whether or not it's even feasible to conduct one. And unless you're looking at a very small population, the answer to that question is probably no. Just think about how much work it takes for the government to try to conduct a census for the entire country. That's a huge amount of work. And even if the data that we were interested in was something as simple as finding the average height of all St. Francis students, that would still take a considerable amount of work, considering we would have to then measure the heights of 150 students. That's a lot of data to gather. So instead of trying to measure every single individual in a population, it's going to be much simpler and more feasible and more practical to then instead measure just a sample of the members of the population and use that sample data that we get to estimate what the overall outcome would be for the entire population. So there are several possible sampling methods that one can use to collect sample data. Some of them are going to be perfectly valid sampling methods, and others would not be such a good idea. And two examples of bad sampling methods are on this slide. One's called voluntary response sampling, and the other one's called convenience sampling. So let's define both of these. Voluntary response sampling is exactly what it sounds like. Someone is volunteering to respond to your survey or whatever sort of data you're trying to collect. Perhaps that means that you've posted an online poll and you want people's opinion about, I don't know, maybe an upcoming election. Because you're just sort of posting it online and seeing who responds, you're not necessarily going to get a very accurate picture of what the overall population's opinions are, because you're only going to get responses from people who actually care enough to respond to your poll. With convenience sampling, again, that is exactly what it sounds like. You're just taking a sample from whatever data set is convenient to measure. A bit like what the example we gave in class today when we were talking about the average height. It would be very convenient to just walk over to a basketball practice and ask for all the players' heights, but just because it's convenient doesn't necessarily make it a valid sampling method, because of course, as we noted, if we tried to base the average height of all St. Francis students off the average height of just the basketball players, the height that we got would probably be considerably higher than the actual height of our population. So again, voluntary response sampling and convenience sampling are two poor sampling methods that you want to avoid. And we'll talk later on in this section about what type of sampling methods would be preferable to those. Now, why is it that those two sampling methods are bad? And it's because, as we talked about in class today, they introduce bias into your data. The basketball team, their heights would be biased towards a higher height. If I went to my Algebra 1 class and asked for their heights, then there would be a bias towards lower heights than average, just because the Algebra 1 class is comprised of mostly freshmen and they're younger and haven't had as much time to grow as everyone else in the school. So whenever you are taking a sample, you want to make sure that you are avoiding bias in your data. You want to make sure that everyone in the population has an equal chance of being represented. And the best way to do that is to randomly select those people who are going to be part of your sample of your population. And so that random selection is what we will talk about in the next lesson.